Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus said to his disciples, "There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on earth nations will be in dismay, perplexed by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will die of fright in anticipation of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. But when these signs begin to happen, stand erect and raise your heads, because your redemption is at hand. Beware that your hearts do not become drowsy from carousing and drunkenness and the anxieties of daily life, and that day catch you by surprise like a trap. For that day will assault everyone who lives on the face of the earth. Be vigilant at all times, and pray that you have the strength to escape the tribulations that are imminent and to stand before the Son of Man." The Gospel of the Lord. I come from a long line of hunters in my family. My dad and my grandfather, both gone, they love to hunt. And my three brothers are still great hunters, whether it be deer or small game, turkeys or ducks or geese. They love to get out and hunt. And I used to hunt from the time I was 12, when you were allowed to start hunting, till I went to the seminary. And I didn't mind hunting, but my brothers and my dad were so gung-ho about hunting that you were out in the woods by 4 o'clock in the morning, and you didn't get back until it seemed like 6 o'clock at night. You know, I don't even know if it was legal, but we were out there. And all I wanted to do was sleep, you know? Well, I remember my first day of deer hunting. I was 12 years old, and we didn't have enough rifles. I had a shotgun with a pumpkin ball, if any of you know anything about that. And my dad said that during the morning we would go out and we would sit quietly, and the deer would come around, and he'd put us in different places apart from one another, and that if the deer came, then we were to shoot it. Well, it was a beautiful day, but there was snow on the ground already, and there was this light snow coming down, and it was way before dawn. And we trudged through the woods, and my dad finds a perfect spot for me, and it's in the sort of the nook of this big tree, and I sort of sat there. I was all in my hunting clothes and my hat, my boots, and I'm sitting there, and my dad said, "Now just wait and watch, and maybe the deer will come." Well, I sat there, and it was dark, and I was cozy, and the snow is coming down, and I'm sitting there, and I'm watching and waiting and watching and waiting and watching and waiting. And around 3 hours later, I woke up. I had slept that entire time in the nook of that tree, and then what was even more amazing, the sun had come up, the snow had stopped, and all around that tree were deer tracks in the snow. And I learned an important lesson that day, that if you don't stay awake, you'll never get your deer. And that lesson is similar to the one we hear in today's gospel, that unless you stay awake, you'll never become aware of the presence of God in your life. Jesus says in the gospel, he says, don't become drowsy with carousing and drunkenness and the anxieties of life, but be vigilant. Stay awake, for the Lord is coming. You know, on the beginning of this season of Advent, we celebrate the coming of Jesus into the world. We celebrate his past coming 2,000 years as a little baby in Bethlehem. And we look forward to his coming in glory at the end of time. But we also celebrate his coming into our lives each and every day. And the fact is that unless we are awake, unless we are aware of the presence of God in our lives, we will miss it completely. Just like I miss those deer all around me. You know, think about it. We have this amazing ability, we who are human beings, to walk through life like we are sleepwalkers, that we're asleep, and we miss that God is working and acting in our lives. Do you notice what Jesus says into the gospel? He says that we have to be aware of two things, that we can become drowsy and sleepwalkers because of two things: carousing and drunkenness, or being too worried about the anxieties of life. Seems like two complete different personalities, doesn't it? You know, carousing and drunkenness. That really reminds me of a life that it's just all about me, all about pleasure, all about having a good time, and never noticing that there might be some misery in this world around us, that other people may be suffering. You know, I looked up that word carousing, and you almost wanted to see in the dictionary a picture of somebody with the lampshade on their head, you know? Their whole life is just all about my fun, my pleasure, my, let me live my life my way. And you know what, though? If you live your life that way, you can oftentimes miss the presence of God all around you. Because a life of drunkenness and carousing and addictions and just all about pleasure, ultimately, it's very difficult to see the presence of God in someone else because you're so concerned about yourself. It's very difficult to see Christ in the suffering person next to you because you're so concerned about your own pleasure. Jesus says that being joy-filled is a wonderful thing. To enjoy this life is wonderful, but we have to have our eyes open and not just be looking inward. That a selfish life is ultimately a life in which you are just walking through life like a sleepwalker. The other thing Jesus says that can cause us to be drowsy and to be asleep is when we become too concerned with the anxieties of life. You know, haven't you ever had this experience, and I know we probably all have, you know, where life just gets so tough that all you want to do is crawl back into bed, put the blanket up over you, and just forget the world, you know? And maybe if that martini helps you a little bit, that's okay too, you know? Isn't that oftentimes how we go through life? And Jesus says, no, you're just sleepwalking through life if you are just so concerned about the anxieties of life, and it can just lead to such depression. Jesus says, you know, when you're that depressed, and I don't mean clinically depressed, just when you are so down on life and you look at the news and you see all the evil and the misery in the world, and you just think, I just don't want to be involved with life anymore. Jesus says you'll never be aware of the presence of God if that is your attitude. And so ultimately what we see is we have to have that kind of balance in our lives. You know, yes, we should be joyful and we should thank God for the wonderful gifts of this life and never be afraid to party. That's okay. But we can't become that can't be our whole life. You know, what they say about people here in America and probably the world is we're so afraid of being bored. You know, we go from one thing to another. You know, I'm famous, and thank God I don't have a wife because I can just flip through every channel around 1,000 times in a half an hour, you know? What else is better? What else is good, you know? I think very simply we have to recognize too is that we have to take life seriously, but not too serious that it gets us down. You know, we're only given one life. And we have been given this life not to walk through it like a sleepwalker, not to be asleep, but rather to be alive, to be awake, to recognize the presence of God working and acting in our lives. You know, the great saints say that very simply, another definition of holiness is to be awake, to be aware of all the things around you, to be aware of the beauty of nature around you. If you're always looking at the ground, you'll never be able to see the beauty in the world. If you're only ever thinking about yourself, you'll never be able to see Jesus in your wife or your husband or your children. If you only are concerned with your own pleasure, you'll never be able to see Jesus suffering, perhaps even within your own family. Very simply, brothers and sisters, as we come together on this first day of the church year, this first Sunday of Advent, let us have a new beginning. Let us listen very carefully to the words of Jesus, which we'll hear throughout the season of Lent. He says, be vigilant, be awake, be aware. The Lord is coming into your life. And what an awful thing it would be if you go through life and you miss him. The Lord is knocking on your door. The Lord is trying to enter into your life at every moment. If you're asleep, life will just pass you by. But if you're awake, if you're aware of the presence of the Lord in your life, then you will meet him and your life will be changed forever. And so my words to you are the words of Jesus as we begin this season of Advent. Very simply, be awake.